was a time when I believed my life would always be predictable. Every morning began the same way. I watered the flowers on my small apartment balcony, made a cup of coffee, and left for work with a book in my bag that I rarely had time to read. My days were quiet. Some people would have called them peaceful. Others would have called them lonely. I never minded being alone. What I minded was feeling invisible. I had lived in the same neighborhood for almost 6 years. People recognized my face, smiled politely, and continued with their lives. I wasn't part of anyone's family celebrations or weekend gatherings. My closest relatives lived several states away, and my work as a graphic designer kept me busy enough that I rarely noticed how small my world had become. The one person who always seemed to notice me was my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Harper. She lived in the charming white cottage next to my apartment building. While everyone else admired her beautiful garden from a distance, she spent nearly every day caring for it herself. The garden looked like something from an old storybook. Rows of lavender stretched beside narrow stone paths. Climbing roses covered wooden arches. Colorful tulips appeared every spring, followed by lilies, daisies, hydrangeas, and countless flowers whose names I never learned. People often stopped outside her fence just to admire it. Many asked if they could take photographs. Mrs. Harper never seemed interested in the attention. She simply smiled whenever someone complimented the flowers and returned to trimming branches or pulling weeds. For reasons I never completely understood, she always treated me differently. Every Saturday morning, I worked on my balcony while she cared for the garden below. Without saying much, she would occasionally leave a small basket near my door. Sometimes it contained fresh herbs, sometimes tomatoes or strawberries, sometimes a bouquet of flowers that made my apartment smell like spring for days. I always thanked her with homemade cookies or fresh bread. It became our quiet tradition. Neither of us spoke very much. We didn't need to. There was something comforting about sharing kindness without filling every silence with words. Over the years, I learned little pieces of her life. She had lived in the neighborhood for more than 40 years. She had lost her husband many years earlier. She had no children living nearby. Her nieces and nephews visited only a few times each year. Most of her happiest memories seemed connected to that garden. Every flower had a story. Every tree had been planted to celebrate an important moment. She once explained that gardening taught patience better than anything else. Seeds never hurried. Flowers never competed with one another. Everything bloomed exactly when it was ready. I thought about those words more often than I expected. One autumn afternoon, I returned home from work and noticed that her front gate was open. That had never happened before. The garden looked strangely quiet. The usual birds seemed absent. The wind carried dry leaves across the stone pathway. A neighbor quietly told me that Mrs. Harper had been taken to the hospital earlier that morning. I felt an unexpected heaviness settle inside me. Although we weren't close in the traditional sense, the thought of the neighborhood without her felt impossible. For the next several weeks, I often looked toward her cottage while leaving for work. The curtains remained closed. The flowers continued blooming, but small weeds slowly appeared between the pathways. Without realizing why, I found myself pulling a few weeds whenever I walked past. The following evening, I watered several flower beds. A few days later, I trimmed dead branches. Nobody asked me to do it. It simply felt wrong to watch the garden slowly disappear. Soon it became part of my daily routine. Every evening after work, I spent half an hour caring for the flowers before returning to my apartment. Some neighbors thanked me, others barely noticed. I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it because the garden somehow felt alive. Winter arrived, covering everything beneath soft layers of snow. The flowers disappeared until spring, then one cold February morning I received the news I had secretly feared for months. Mrs. Harper had passed away peacefully during the night. For several minutes I simply sat in silence. It felt strange to mourn someone whose voice I had heard so rarely, yet grief isn't measured by the number of conversations people share. Sometimes it grows quietly through years of ordinary moments. The funeral was small. Neighbors stood together beneath gray skies. Family members I had never met arrived from different cities. Most of them looked around the property with curious eyes rather than emotional ones. Several spoke more about the value of the land than about the woman who had lived there. That observation left an uncomfortable feeling inside me. After the service, I quietly returned home. I assumed life would eventually continue as before. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, an official letter arrived in my mailbox. At first, I assumed it had been delivered by mistake. My name appeared clearly on the envelope. Inside was a formal request asking me to attend the reading of Mrs. Harper's will. I stared at the page several times. There had to be some misunderstanding. Why would I be included? I wasn't family. I wasn't even a close friend. For 2 days, I considered ignoring the invitation. Curiosity eventually won. The lawyer's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building downtown. The waiting room felt unusually tense. Several relatives sat together, speaking quietly among themselves. The moment I entered, every pair of eyes turned toward me. Some looked confused, others looked annoyed. I chose a chair near the window and avoided meeting anyone's gaze. When the meeting finally began, the lawyer carefully explained Mrs. Harper's final wishes. Most of her savings would be divided among relatives and several local charities. The cottage itself would eventually be sold. Then he paused. He opened another envelope. His expression softened. According to Mrs. Harper's written instructions, her garden would not be included with the sale of the property. Instead, responsibility for caring for the garden had been left to one person, me. For several seconds, I honestly believed I had misunderstood. The lawyer repeated my name. Every person in the room turned toward me. The silence became almost unbearable. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Why me? I had never expected anything from Mrs. Harper. Not money, not property, certainly not something as personal as the garden she had spent decades creating. The silence ended abruptly as whispers spread across the room. Some relatives exchanged frustrated looks, others openly questioned the decision. One woman folded her arms and stared directly at me with obvious suspicion. Another quietly shook his head. Although nobody accused me directly, I could feel their thoughts. They believed I had somehow influenced an elderly woman, that I had earned her trust for selfish reasons. The idea hurt far more than I expected. By the time I stepped outside, I could barely breathe. The spring air felt unusually cold. I walked home without noticing where I was going. When I finally reached Mrs. Harper's cottage, I stopped in front of the familiar wooden gate. The garden looked exactly as it always had, peaceful, beautiful, completely unaware that everything around it had changed. I rested my hand on the gate for a long moment. Then I quietly whispered a promise that nobody else would ever hear. I didn't know why she had chosen me, but before making any decision, I was determined to find the answer. The morning after the reading of the will, I woke up hoping everything would feel less confusing. It didn't. For several minutes, I simply stood on my balcony looking toward Mrs. Harper's garden. The flowers moved gently in the breeze, completely unchanged. Only my life had become different. I still couldn't understand why she had chosen me. There had to be something I didn't know. I unlocked the wooden gate and stepped inside. For years, I had admired the garden from outside the fence or while helping with small chores, but now I noticed details I had overlooked. Every pathway had been carefully designed. The roses weren't planted randomly. The lavender formed gentle borders between different sections. Each tree had enough space to grow without blocking the sunlight from smaller plants. Nothing had happened by accident. The entire garden reflected decades of patience. As I slowly walked through it, I realized I wasn't just looking at flowers, I was looking at someone's life. The relatives visited the property later that afternoon. I recognized several faces from the lawyer's office. They walked around the cottage, taking photographs and discussing renovations that could increase its value before selling it. Every time they looked toward me, the conversation suddenly became quieter. I pretended not to notice. A few days later, the first unpleasant surprise arrived. Someone had left a handwritten note inside my mailbox. There was no signature, only one sentence: "You should be ashamed of taking advantage of an old woman." I read it several times before quietly throwing it away. I wanted to believe it had been written by someone who didn't know the truth. Still, the words stayed with me. For the first time since Mrs. Harper's passing, I questioned whether I should simply refuse everything. Maybe that would make everyone's lives easier. Maybe the family deserved the garden more than I did. That evening, I sat alone on one of the old wooden benches beneath a flowering cherry tree. The air smelled of fresh grass and roses. I closed my eyes, trying to imagine what Mrs. Harper would have wanted. Then something unusual caught my attention. One of the bench legs seemed slightly uneven. As I moved it, I heard a soft sound beneath the wooden seat. Curious, I knelt down. Hidden underneath was a small metal box secured by a simple latch. It was unlocked. Inside lay an old brass key. Nothing else. No note. No explanation. Only the key. I turned it over in my hand. A tiny paper tag still hung from it. Faded handwriting read only two words: "Garden Shed." I remembered the small wooden shed standing near the back fence. Mrs. Harper had always kept it locked. I had assumed it contained gardening tools. The key fit perfectly. The old door creaked open with surprising ease. Sunlight entered through dusty windows, illuminating shelves filled with neatly organized pots, watering cans, seed packets, and hand tools. Everything looked exactly as she had left it. I smiled. Then I noticed another object. A weathered wooden chest stood beneath one of the windows. Unlike everything else, it was covered with a thin layer of dust. I carefully lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. Beneath them rested a thick leather journal. My hands hesitated. It felt deeply personal. For several moments, I wondered whether opening it would betray her trust. Then I remembered the lawyer's words. Mrs. Harper had specifically left the garden in my care. Perhaps she had expected me to find this place. I slowly opened the journal. The first pages contained sketches of flower beds, notes about planting seasons, lists of seeds, simple reminders. Then the entries became more personal. She wrote about the day she and her husband planted the first apple tree. She described how frightened she had felt after becoming a widow. She admitted that tending the garden had given her a reason to get out of bed every morning. Each season represented another chance to begin again. As I continued reading, I began recognizing familiar moments. She had written about neighbors, children who stopped to smell the flowers, birds that returned every spring, the elderly mail carrier who always admired the roses. Then, unexpectedly, I found my own name. The date was nearly 5 years old. She described seeing me carrying heavy grocery bags during a rainstorm. She noticed that I had smiled at every passerby despite looking exhausted. She wrote that kindness often revealed itself when people believed nobody was watching. Further entries mentioned the baskets of vegetables she left outside my apartment. She noticed that I always returned the baskets clean. She remembered every loaf of homemade bread I baked for her, every flower I watered without being asked. Every evening I quietly removed weeds while believing nobody noticed. Tears slowly filled my eyes. I had never imagined she paid attention to those ordinary moments. To me, they had never felt important. To her, they meant everything. Then I reached an entry written shortly after she had become ill. The handwriting looked weaker, more fragile. She admitted she worried constantly about the future of the garden, not because of the flowers, because she feared someone would see only valuable land instead of a lifetime of memories. She wrote that gardens couldn't survive on ownership alone. They survived because someone loved caring for them every single day. I closed the journal for several minutes. The silence inside the shed felt almost sacred. Outside, birds sang exactly as they always had. The world hadn't changed, only my understanding had. I returned to the cottage just before sunset. Several relatives were standing near the front porch. One of them approached me, His expression remained polite, but distant, although he never directly accused me of anything. It was obvious he believed the will had been unfair. He couldn't understand why a neighbor had received responsibility for something the family considered theirs. I couldn't blame him. If I hadn't known Mrs. Harper, I might have wondered the same thing, but now I knew something they didn't. The garden had never been a prize. It had been a promise. That night I continued reading the journal until long after midnight. Near the final pages, I discovered something tucked between two entries, a folded piece of paper. Unlike the rest of the journal, this page wasn't part of her daily notes. Across the top, in careful handwriting, she had written, "To the person who finally opens this journal." My heart began to race. I unfolded the paper carefully. Before reading the first line, I somehow knew that everything I believed about the garden was about to change forever. For several moments, I simply stared at the folded letter in my hands. It felt as though Mrs. Harper had been waiting for this exact moment. I unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was slightly unsteady, but every word was clear. She explained that whoever found the letter had already discovered the most important truth about the garden. It had never been about flowers. It had never been about property. It had always been about care. She wrote that many people admired the beauty of the garden, but very few noticed the daily work hidden behind that beauty. Everyone loved seeing flowers in bloom. Almost nobody wanted to spend hours pulling weeds, watering dry soil, pruning branches, or protecting delicate plants during harsh winters. She believed the same was true about people. Many admired success. Far fewer appreciated the quiet effort that made it possible. As I continued reading, I found another sentence that stayed with me forever. She wrote that a garden always revealed a person's character. Someone who truly cared for living things would never rush them. They would simply return each day, offering patience instead of control. I slowly lowered the letter. The entire cottage felt strangely peaceful. For the first time since her passing, I understood why she had chosen me, not because I was special, not because I deserved a reward, because she had watched me care for something that wasn't mine again and again, without expecting anything in return. The following morning, I returned to the lawyer's office. I carried the journal with me. After a long conversation, he explained that the letter wasn't a legal document, but it clearly expressed Mrs. Harper's intentions. The responsibility she had left me wasn't ownership in the traditional sense. It was stewardship. The land itself would eventually belong to the family after the cottage was sold, but according to her wishes, the garden was to remain protected and maintained rather than destroyed for future development. It wasn't exactly what the relatives had expected. Within days, they requested another meeting. I dreaded attending. I expected arguments. Instead, I brought the journal. I didn't intend to defend myself. I only wanted them to understand the woman they had lost. One by one, I placed the notebooks and letter on the table. I explained how Mrs. Harper had spent years writing about the garden, how every tree marked an important memory, how every flower reminded her of someone she loved. Most importantly, I shared the pages where she described why she had chosen me, not because I had asked, because I had quietly cared for the garden while believing nobody noticed. The room became silent. Several relatives carefully turned the pages. One woman quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Another man stopped reading for several minutes while staring out the window. For the first time since the funeral, nobody looked at me with suspicion. They were finally seeing Mrs. Harper instead of seeing only the will. One of her nephews later admitted something that surprised me. He confessed that he hadn't visited his aunt as often as he should have. Work, distance, and everyday responsibilities had slowly become excuses. He realized he had assumed there would always be more time. There wasn't. That simple admission changed the atmosphere. Completely, the conversation stopped being about blame. It became about regret and eventually about gratitude. Several weeks later, the family made a decision together. The cottage would still be sold, just as Mrs. Harper had planned, but the garden would remain exactly as she had wished. The new owners agreed to preserve it. A small agreement ensured that I could continue caring for it alongside local volunteers. Even more surprising, two of Mrs. Harper's relatives asked if they could help during weekends. At first, they admitted they knew almost nothing about gardening. Neither had I. When this journey began, we learned together. Spring slowly turned into summer. The garden became full of life once again. Neighbors noticed, children stopped to watch. Butterflies, older couples rested on nearby benches. Visitors admired the flowers, just as they always had, but now something else had changed. People no longer hurried past one another. Several neighbors began bringing homemade lemonade for volunteers. Others donated seeds, tools, and young plants. A retired carpenter repaired old benches without accepting payment. A local teacher started bringing students once each month to learn about flowers and pollinating insects without anyone planning it. The garden became more than beautiful. It became a place where people quietly cared for one another. One afternoon, while planting new lavender near the entrance, I discovered a small wooden marker hidden beneath the soil. Time had almost erased the writing. After gently cleaning it, I smiled. Mrs. Harper had carved only for words, "Kindness always leaves roots." I decided not to move it. Instead, we planted fresh flowers around it so future visitors might discover it someday. Just as I had. Years passed, life continued changing. The cottage belonged to another family now. Children's laughter once again filled the front porch. The roses climbed higher every spring. The apple tree Mrs. Harper and her husband had planted decades earlier still produced fruit every autumn. Sometimes visitors asked who had designed such a beautiful garden. I always smiled. No single person had. One woman had planted it, many people had protected it, and countless others had been inspired by it. The journal remains safely inside my home. From time to time, I reread a few pages, not because I feared forgetting Mrs. Harper, because her words reminded me to notice the quiet things that truly mattered. One evening, several years after everything had happened, a young woman moved into the apartment building where I had once lived alone. She looked nervous. She carried too many boxes by herself. Without thinking, I walked over and helped her. A few days later, I left a small basket of fresh herbs outside her door. There was no note. No explanation. The following weekend, I found homemade cookies waiting outside mine. I couldn't help smiling. Some traditions don't need instructions, they simply continue. Every spring, the first roses bloom beside the front gate just as they always have. Whenever I see them, I remember something Mrs. Harper once taught me without ever saying it directly. The most meaningful things we leave behind are rarely money, houses, or possessions. They are the habits of kindness that quietly become part of someone else's life. I once believed the garden had never been mine. Now I understand that I was right. It never belonged to me. It never truly belonged to Mrs. Harper either. The garden belonged to every act of patience, every helping hand, every person willing to care for something expecting nothing in return, and perhaps that is why it still blooms more beautifully with each passing year, not because of the flowers, because of the people who learned that kindness, like a well-tended garden, continues growing long after the gardener is gone.